Where do you think the mythology, I suppose, of bats being harmful, is it all from, Dracula and vampire type of mythology?
We're all just naturally most fearful of the things we understand least. And bats have the misfortune of working the night shift. If you, for example, are walking home after working a night shift, you're much more likely to be distrusted, turned into the police by your neighbors.
Yeah, makes sense. What was it about bats for you, I guess, that has kept you so captivated by them over the last 60 years?
Well, they're incredibly diverse. They're amazingly sophisticated. They have social systems strikingly similar to our own. There are 1,400 species. They adopt orphans. They share information. They're incredibly important to healthy ecosystems and human economies.
When we talk about, most of us listening we're gardeners by trade, and we're looking for ways to control pests. Obviously, there's some human ways you can do that, but the more you can build an ecology or an ecosystem, even just in a backyard garden, at least from my perspective, the better. And so I don't really know much about how bats play a part of that, pest control or maybe feeding ecosystem at night and maybe just a backyard garden. What can you share there?
Bats have an incredible role to play in control of nocturnal flying pests. They have impact on almost every kind of pest you can think of, everything from moths and beetles to stink bugs to plant hoppers to just mosquitoes, almost anything you can think of. They're helping keep them in balance.
When do they start that, I guess, feeding cycle? I guess like as dusk approaches and then throughout the entire night, are they taking care of pests?
The majority of insect activity occurs in the first 3 hours of night, so that's when the bats are the most likely, most insect-eating bats are the most active, and then they tend to be active again toward dawn as there's another peak in insect activity. But they eat huge numbers of insects. We have a colony under our Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin that consumes tons of insect pests every night, and a cave not far from here, Bracken Cave, it's 10 to 20 million bats eat more than 100 tons of insects nightly, and a large proportion of those are pests. We'd be buried in insects we don't want to associate with if it wasn't for bats.
That is wild. Yeah, I mean, usually when people say tons, they're using it as a colloquialism, but in this case, we're talking literal 2,000-pound tons worth of insects. That's when you're mentioning that.
I usually like to add that literal right in there because people think that exactly.
Yeah. To me, I've transitioned, at least in my garden, to mostly not really spraying any kind of pesticides or herbicides or fungicides or anything like that. But, for beginner gardeners or someone who's in their backyard just kind of trying to take care of weeds and stuff, is there anything that would disrupt the ability of a bat to do the job for them, basically?
The more pesticides you're using in your yard, the less there is for bats to eat that is safe to eat. It certainly helps if you preserve as much native vegetation as you can. Bats don't just protect farms and gardens. Crops are harvested, and in between crops, there's nothing for a bat to eat if there's no biodiversity. That's why oftentimes when people put up bat houses near rivers, they do better, because we normally leave diverse vegetation along rivers in what we call riparian habitats, and they produce insects that the bats can maintain themselves with in between times when we really need them, like cucumber beetles or cordierworm moths. These are only there during certain parts of the year, and the bats have to have something to eat during the rest of the year.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess it would be similar. I was talking once with someone who did a documentary on pollinators in general, but it was mostly about bees, and it was about the managed honeybee industry, which I didn't know was a thing until I spoke with him. And he was saying something somewhat similar, where in these orchards or these nut fields, they've basically removed all the native vegetation to the point where there is nothing left for bees to forage on except for the orchard crop, which of course is not in season all year long. And so it's created an industry where they've had to bring in honeybees from elsewhere because they've ruined the ability of the ecosystem to actually do it itself. And it sounds like the same thing is kind of in play for bats.
There are places in the world where they actually give incentives for farmers to leave rows of flowering plants in between, say, orchards of nuts or something else, so that they do maintain bees and wasps that are needed for pollination and for pest control.
Yeah, I mean, as a gardener too, what we often recommend is when fall comes, just leave the vegetation on the ground. Don't clean the whole garden up completely. Not only for bats, I guess, but also just for the insect life that is going to reproduce and eventually just feed them.
Yeah.
So it makes total sense. It's a twist though, and I think what a lot of us grew up doing, I can speak for myself, growing up as like a suburban kid, it's seen as messy to do something like that, and it's just not in the culture, I suppose, and as you kind of unprogram that, you realize actually that's what we should be doing.
Yes, I know of situations in which people have actually been sued for not keeping well-maintained mowed lawns. If a real native plant crops up in your yard, your neighbors think there's something wrong with you. You're not maintaining your yard well.
It just happened to my brother. He just bought a house in Santa Ana area, and he just got from the Santa Ana like municipality. They send him a fine for not mowing his yard, but his backyard is full of native, native plants, maybe some non-native stuff, but regardless, better than a completely sterile dirt lot, obviously, but not to the city.
Well, he's probably helping make the neighborhood safer because, for example, bats do eat, in fact, a lot more mosquitoes than we originally thought they did. The bats that are eating mosquitoes have to have something else to eat when there aren't mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are very patchy in time. It rains and there's puddle seed around at a certain time, and then there's a big explosion of mosquitoes. The bats haven't had anything else to eat in the interim. They're not going to be present when you need them to attack the new hatch of mosquitoes.
Or they would decide like the area is not a safe place to live because it's not reliable. There's not food around.
They'd find a better spot that's a little bit more consistent.
Bats that protect crops can't do it if we don't leave them anything else to survive on in between. For example, there's a study published a few years ago in the Mediterranean where scientists put up bat houses strategically located around rice crops. They ended up, over a period of years, reducing the moths that attack rice there sufficiently that they didn't need to use pesticides anymore. But they point out very strongly in their paper, had there not been a national park not far away where the bats could go and feed in the off-season, their experiment wouldn't have worked, because once the rice was harvested, what would happen to the bats? They wouldn't have any food.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it makes total sense when you put it that way, but I think, especially from, coming from a gardener's perspective, as you gain years and years of experience doing it, you start to see the patterns, but it can be hard in the first couple of years of growing to put all that stuff together, which is why it's great to have someone like you on. I just have a random question about bats. Maybe it's a too simple question, but is there an area, let's say of the United States, where there are no native bat species in that particular area, or are they ever present throughout the USA?
Bats are found just about everywhere where there are humans. There are particular areas where you'd have to look long and hard to find a bat because there's nothing for them to eat or no place to live.
Watch the full episode right here and subscribe for more new episodes every single week.